pass tax legislation for 10 years. So, Director Mulvaney, can you speak to the importance of tax permanence in achieving long-term sustainable growth envisioned in the President's budget?
I can. Thank you, Senator. And in fact, we assume that for the largest portions of the tax bill. We assume that in our budget, even though the tax bill that passed ends the individual tax rate reduction after 5 years, we assume its permanence. In fact, you'll see that there's a variation between the CBO baseline for revenues over the course of the next 10 years and our budget. Fully $500 billion of that is associated with that extension. We don't extend some of the smaller tax reductions. I think there was some specific 1- and 2-year programs that are not extended. But under the proposals in this budget, the individual tax rates and the corporate tax rates would be permanent.
I've heard the rule that the administration put out that for striking or implementing regulations, 2 have to be repealed. I've heard the President speak about hundreds of regulations being reduced. I would like to have you give me some data that will show the benefits of such, because maybe you're eliminating regulations that haven't been enforced for the last 20 years. What good does that do? I'm not bad-mouthing what the President's trying to accomplish here, because I think less regulations has had a great deal to do with increasing the economic growth. But can you put some quantifiable terms so we can see what this is doing to benefit the economy?
I can do it a couple different ways. First of all, I want to thank Congress for taking up under the CRA revision, I think it was 15, 16, or 17 different regulations, and want to reinforce the fact that while the administration can take steps to undo regulations, it can be slow, it can be tedious, and it might not be permanent. When you all take it up under the CRA, you make sure that no future administration ever makes a similar rule. So I want to thank you on behalf of the administration for the work you've undertaken there. The actual ratio that we've achieved, Senator, this year instead of 2-to-1 was 22-to-1 on major regulations. We had 22 major rules and regs revoked versus, I think, only 3 or 4 brand new ones total. The total number of rules, regulations, other limitations that were either withdrawn, made inactive, or delayed is approaching 1,600. The net present value benefit of that to the economy last year was $8 billion. And that will go forward now. So we really do believe, in fact, I think if you go back, you talked about economic growth, Senator, we actually saw increases in economic growth, improvements in economic growth before the tax bill was even actually fleshed out, let alone passed. And we absolutely believe that the work the administration and Congress did to roll back the regulatory burden had an immediate impact on the economic health of this country, and that is sustainable and structural. It's not stimulus. It's not a sugar high. It's something that fixes the economy long term. So it's something we look forward to continuing. The President continues to make it a priority for the administration, and we will continue to make it a priority as we move forward next year.
I got 3 seconds left. I don't expect you to answer this question, but I want to make sure that you know it's important to me by, instead of putting it in an email to you. As you know, the Senate has been working to try to stabilize the durable medical equipment Medicare benefit. This benefit is important because it allows patients to remain in their homes, avoiding hospitalization. The Obama administration put in place a rule that applied competitive bidding rates to rural and other areas that were expressly excluded from the competitive bidding program. In some cases, these changes resulted in rates being below the cost suppliers incur for providing services and equipment. And I was encouraged in August last year when I saw that CMS sent an interim final rule to OMB that would mitigate these changes. However, this rule has been pending since then. So I want you to tell me in writing specific steps you're taking to make sure that the OMB reviews and releases that rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome.
First, I have to start, Director Mulvaney, and say, I can't believe here you go again on the Great Lakes. I can't believe this. Last year, the administration zeroed out the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a bipartisan initiative strongly supported in the House and the Senate to make sure that we have dollars available for emergencies as well as water quality issues and so on. And after you zeroed it out last year, we put the full funding back in, strong support from the entire region, and now you're back again with almost zeroing it out. And so I just don't understand it. I mean, I know that last year you said this was a local issue, but believe it or not, there's another country that cares about this right next to us called Canada. And we have a Great Lakes Initiative with 8 states. It's funded federal, state, local, and internationally. But the administration doesn't seem to understand that 20% of the world's fresh water surrounding the Great Lakes is important. So please explain this to me.
Thank you, Senator, and you're absolutely correct. We did zero that out last year. I believe that after the CAPS deal, one of the add-backs we made, either to 18 or 19, I can't remember which one it was for $30 billion for split between that and the Chesapeake, some of the work we're doing in the Chesapeake Bay. What our research indicated over the course of the last year, and you did raise this with our office, as did many members of the area, both the House and the Senate from both parties, was that there's some federal long-term monitoring programs ongoing, and we propose to continue to fund that, but also to send the message at the same time this is not something that we're interested in doing long-term. We do consider it to be regional. We do consider it to be something that the states are capable of doing, and that we would very much like to see us get out of that business in the long term.
This is a major resource for our country, I would just say. I don't know, have you seen the Great Lakes? You ever been?
Yes, ma'am.
So we're like the ocean without the salt. It's pretty big. 1 out of 5 jobs in Michigan comes from the water. It's a very big deal. $16 billion boating industry, $7 billion fishing industry. I could go on, and that's just Michigan. And so the idea of taking what is a commitment every year of $300 million to be able to tackle things like Asian carp, which we're trying to keep out of the lakes, and instead put in $30 million. Again, we're going to go right back at it again and do our level best to make sure that this doesn't happen. But I don't understand why this major natural resource for our country, where 40 million people get their drinking water from the entire region, is something that this administration doesn't understand. So we're going to go back at it again and hopefully be able to keep the funding going. Something else I wanted to ask you about, and that relates to Michigan and Canada again. We trade everything across bridge and tunnels and so on except prescription drugs. We're not allowed, and we have probably the highest prices for prescription drugs in the world. And we can drive 10 minutes across a bridge and lower the prices oftentimes 40%, 50% for seniors and others. So we're not talking about luxuries here. We're talking about, in many cases, whether or not people are going to get their cancer medicine, their insulin. It's life and death. So President Trump has made promises about lowering the cost of prescription drugs. And the administration could open the border right now to safe importation. And Senator Sanders is offering a bill that I'm a co-sponsor of. I've taken bus trips with seniors to Canada over the years, and I'm wondering, we haven't seen any action so far, so is it fair to say the President doesn't support opening up the border to re-import safe prescription drugs into the United States?
I will say this, Senator. I believe that is a promise that the President has already started to keep. The things that we've done in the administration already this year, as part of the changes at CMS, have actually already saved our seniors this year, 2018, over $300 million. And
have prices been going down? I'm sorry, I'm
actually,
not aware
of
prices
went down either within Medicare or Medicaid in 17 for the first time since 2012. So
on reimportation, which would
no,
bring
ma'am, not on
things down.
reimportation. And we don't address that in the budget, but there are other ways to get at this issue. I believe you may have heard that the President actually mentioned lowering drug prices in the State of the Union address. The budget contains a series of proposals, including a doubling of the funding for the FDA, an extra $100 million this year in order to work on generics. We've had successes there already. We look forward to continuing
Yes,
those.
and I do support generic drugs and more competition in that area, and I think that that's very important. But I also know there are things that he could do right away. His own commission that looked at the opioid crisis recommended that there be immediate negotiation to bring down the price of naloxone, and that could be done and hasn't been done. Opening up the border to be able to bring lower cost prescription drugs can come back. I am very concerned that at this point we have seen, I will conclude, Mr. Chairman, that when we look at what is actually happening in the marketplace for seniors, because folks aren't talking to me about prices going down, they're talking to me about prices going up. What I'm concerned about is we have seen major windfalls from the tax cut. ABVI now is going to have an effective tax rate cut to 9%. The corporate rate was 35 to 9, and others as well. And I would just say, I haven't seen anybody lowering prices because they got a big windfall in the tax cut. And that would be something that would be very nice for the President to focus on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Corker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Mulvaney. Welcome back. I do want to applaud you for creating a more real budget. It seems that every year we have these fake budgets that balance in 10 years. It doesn't matter who the administration is or what side of the aisle they're on. We have these fictitious budgets that create imaginary things that are never going to occur, and you didn't do that. So I want to thank you for that. I know that you and I are of the same ilk. We care deeply about the deficits that our nation has. I know you were a strong proponent of balanced budgets when you were in the House, and now you're in this position. And we as a nation, as you know, are on an unsustainable path. And I don't want to get into specifics right now, and I think we all understand where we are as a nation. And you know, I was somewhat discouraged that the cap deal that was reached last week was really far above what even the President had asked for. So I think we have to say that Congress, in this particular case, went way beyond what the President was even requesting. As strong of a military supporter as he is, and I am, Congress went way beyond that, both on military spending and on non-military spending. So you've had to actually jack your budget up. So as people are giving you a hard time today about deficits, you actually requested less money, and at the last moment had to elevate everything to take into account what Congress on its own accord did to create even bigger deficits. And so what I'd like to ask you is, just philosophically, where do we go? I mean, by 2028, we're going to be at 91% debt to GDP. I know that our military leaders would tell us that our deficits are the greatest threat to our nation, not Russia, not ISIS, not the many things that we're dealing with in the Middle East and around the world, but our debt. I know that you care about that. So just philosophically, tell me where we go from here.
Well, I think the budget gives some insight into that, Senator. Keep in mind, even though it doesn't balance within the 10-year window, this budget still represents a $3 trillion reduction in spending over the course of the 10-year window. That's the second largest reduction in proposed spending of any budget ever. The only one that's larger was the budget that we introduced last year. In fact, but for the caps deal, it probably would have been larger this year. That's a $1.7 trillion reduction of that $3 in mandatory spending. We, to Senator Sanders' point, I would contend to you that we absolutely keep our promises. We do not take a look at or make any reforms to Social Security retirement. We do not take a look at or make any reforms to Medicare recipients, services that they get, but there are other monies that can be saved. We saved $1.7 trillion in mandatory spending here by doing it, looking at things like the way drugs are priced within Medicare. We do some tremendous, I think, new ideas on things like food stamps and the Farm Bill, other mandatory spending. There are some good ideas out there in this budget that the legislature could take up to get real long-term savings and that could make a dent in that GDP ratio. In fact, I think you see by the end of our budget, even though we don't balance, we're getting very close, and we do bend the curve down in terms of a GDP, debt per GDP. I think we're down below 1.5% debt to GDP by the end of this window. So that's a tremendous move in the right direction.
And so over the longer term, I think most of us realize that with baby boomer generation, this is going to go on for some time. Over the longer term, based on the way you see Congress acting and you see the other pressures that we have to invest in things like infrastructure, you're actually more hopeful because it doesn't feel that way to me that we're heading in a hopeful direction as it relates to solving our nation's deficits.
I consider myself to be an optimist. With no disrespect to my Democrat friends, I think one of the reasons I'm a Republican is that I'm an optimist. I will tell you, though, that there was a very interesting dynamic in going through the plussing up of the budgets. It's a lot more fun to spend money than it is to reduce. It's a lot harder to reduce spending in the long term than it is to spend. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to start making difficult decisions, to decide together as a legislature, as an administration, are these deficits that we're really willing to tolerate? We aren't as an administration, which is why we have a budget that bends that curve down in the appropriate direction, and we hope that the legislature takes us up on some of the ideas that we offer this year. One
last question. My time is expiring. There's a huge plus up in several areas. I mean, that take some of the agencies that are plussed up per this last cap deal, including the Pentagon, which I support making sure that our military has what it needs. But the plus up is so large that you could have a situation where people are just rushing to get contracts out the door to take advantage of the monies that are available that year. What are y'all doing to ensure that we don't end up doing multiple wasteful things in light of these massive plus-ups in 1 year?
I'll give you one example. I think one thing the administration is extraordinarily proud of, in addition to increasing the spending in the Defense Department, for the first time ever, as of September, the DoD now tells us they are ready to be audited. We are starting that process. In fact, we've already seen the first fruits of that. You saw a report last week about the Pentagon's inability to track about $800 million. That's a good thing, because that was something that we've been able to expose, and now we'll be able to fix. So we absolutely take that risk seriously and hope to be able to do better with it now that we've made some improvements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I share Senator Corker's frustrations with where we are, and I think you, Mr. Chairman, have expressed similar frustrations. We have a ridiculous budget process, and as a result of that, we end up with ridiculous budgets. This budget is going no place. We all know that. It was cooked up in the laboratories of the Koch brothers and a bunch of other creepy billionaires who want to remake America in Ayn Rand's image. It is cooked up in the laboratories of polluters who want absolutely no regulation so they can despoil at will. It includes over $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that are clearly going no place. It is completely out of step with the funding bill that the president just signed and touted. It's off by $58 billion just from the non-defense discretionary part of the funding bill that the president just signed. It knocks down HHS with a 21% cut, as opposed to the funding bill that we just passed, which has $6 billion in opioid fundings that I think Americans desperately need. The funding bill we just passed added $20 billion in infrastructure-related investments. This cuts it by $40 billion for a $60 billion delta going the wrong way on infrastructure. And part of the reason that these silly things are in here is because the process is so silly. It is completely partisan, which is why it ends up cooked up in extremist laboratories, and it's unrelated to the funding process because of its failures. We have a budget process over here that ends up producing nothing, and then we have a funding process that's led by leadership and the appropriators that ends up actually doing the work of putting the funding measures of government together. And there's virtually no relationship between the two. The budget is like a firework that goes off with a big bang, and everybody pays attention to it because it's noisy and bright, and it has zero effect on the people who actually make the decisions year in and year out on funding the government. And I think it's a shame. And I think the signals that this is wrong are, first of all, that there's no bipartisanship whatsoever. That's been a problem for a long time. It's a vehicle for one party to express its political persuasion, to express its loyalty to its big funders, and to create a path for another purely partisan vote using the reconciliation measure. That's basically all it accomplishes. A budget process that worked would also look at tax expenditures. More money goes out the back door of the tax code than gets spent through most of these appropriations, and yet we don't look at that. The health care expenditure of the country, of the federal government, in the 10-year out period has been estimated to have fallen by about $3 trillion. That's a big number, and we don't know why. I think it has something to do with ACOs and with payment reform and with changes in treatment by doctors at the local level that are actually driving down per patient year-over-year costs, but we don't know that. We ought to be vitally interested in trying to figure out why we got that $3 trillion and how we can make more of it if we're getting it by better patient care. My God, what could be more important than improving patient care and lowering costs at the same time instead of going after preposterous cuts? We have to have the budget have some parliamentary effect if it's going to be meaningful. Right now, the budget has zero parliamentary effect because the 60-vote penalty is the 60-vote minimum for appropriations. So we're shooting blanks. We have absolutely no effect here. We are a null factor. And finally, we got to look at revenues. I know it's torture for our Republican friends to look at revenues sometimes, but for crying out loud, we cannot have passion about deficits and then at the same time abandon our passion about deficits as soon as it runs up against the carried interest exception that protects the biggest billionaires on Wall Street. We cannot maintain a passion for deficits that evaporates as soon as it bumps up against tax benefits for big oil, for crying out loud, the companies that need the least tax relief of any companies in the world. And yet, there is this magic disappearing passion about deficits when they bump up against some very obvious ways to raise revenue. Now, we each have our own politics on either side to bring to this, and we can keep ricocheting back and forth from one extreme to the other, but until and unless we have a meaningful bipartisan process that actually looks at tax expenditures and takes a responsible look at what's going on in health care so that we can reduce costs without cutting benefits, and looks at revenues and has some parliamentary effect, all we're doing here is noise-making and firing off fireworks into the sky that people look at and think, oh, that must be really interesting. Look what this budget just did. And in fact, everybody who's in on the scheme knows that it has no effect whatsoever, and the appropriators and the leaders are going to get together and make a deal like they just did, and that is how this is going to continue. We have got, Mr. Chairman, to fix our broken budget process, and one of the best things in the recent funding bill that we just passed was to set up a bicameral committee to take a look at how we solve a broken process. The way to a budget that works is the path of bipartisanship. We have to create such a road, and here endeth my statement. Thank you, Chairman. And by the way, I sincerely appreciate your leadership on this particular question. You may not agree with every word that I said, but I think we have common cause in believing that the budget process needs reform and improvement. And I appreciate your leadership in moving us in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Mulvaney, for your time and testimony today and your service to the country. I agree with my colleague, Senator Whitehouse, about the need for budget reform and a process that's been in place since 1970s. It's worked 2-3 times. My gosh, this is a disaster that's unfolding in the American people, and we've got to find a reform that can actually hold, stick, and work for the American people. But I want to talk about something that is working, and that's the tax cut bill. And I think today some more crumbs were announced for the American people. $1,500 in bonuses from a developer in Maryland. MetLife increasing minimum wages, bonuses, benefit packages around the country are increasing. And I think this is important to talk about. The fact that people are earning more dollars, their wages are going up, benefit packages are increasing. I think our colleague from Vermont talked about utility rates. We've seen now people we've seen utilities reducing their utility rates because of the tax cut bill. Director Mulvaney, what happens when people earn more money from a revenue standpoint?
It goes up. In fact, that's exactly what our projections have shown. Senator Whitehouse has stepped out, but one of the things he mentioned was to look at the revenues. And one of the beneficial impacts of the tax bill is that the revenues are actually up on our projections versus the CBO baseline. In fact, in 2027, we expect that the government will take in almost $350 billion more.
Well, surely these are just
otherwise
crumbs.
would
These
have.
are just crumbs, right?
I've often wondered if $1,000 would be a crumb if it came in the form of a government check.
And so if you're looking at a utility rate that may average $120 for somebody, $120 a month, I think, is perhaps the Pepco region that we're in right here, 300,000 customers, $1,000 plus could cover a year's worth of utility. Do you think that's crumbs?
I do not.
Do you think a minimum wage boost is crumbs?
I do not.
Do you think salary bonuses are crumbs?
Only a very wealthy person from San Francisco would think that was a crumb.
Thank you, Director Mulvaney. And I'm excited for what we have here because you anticipate making this permanent, correct?
We do, yes, sir.
And I think that's
our
important.
revenue assumptions assume that.
It's important that we talk about it. I want to shift to some of the other ideas that are in the legislation. One of the most important things for Colorado's economy is the outdoor economy. It's a huge economic driver. Last year, we passed a bipartisan bill to take a look at the outdoor economy, make sure that it's measured as a part of our overall economic activities, about almost $1 trillion in terms of economic development that's taking place as a result every year of our outdoor recreation economy, consumer spending, et cetera. 7.6 million jobs, $65 billion some dollars in taxes. The budget does zero out land acquisition under Land and Water Conservation Fund. I am concerned about that. Land and water conservation funding doesn't come from tax dollars. It actually is funded through other revenue mechanisms within the budget. So these are not taxpayer dollars being spent in this program. We'd just like to better understand the administration's thinking behind the budget request for something like Land and Water Conservation Fund.
And Senator, we've reached the point where I don't know that one off the top of my head. I apologize. I'd be happy to reach out to you. I know it's important to you and your district. We do a couple of other things that we think would be beneficial to out west, including adding back some money for PILT, which I know is a big deal for Colorado. But I do not know the answer off the top of my head on that particular issue.
And that is very important for Colorado, and I thank you for that. And we'd also save you on some rent money if you moved the BLM office out of Washington, D.C., and you re-headquartered it out in Colorado, perhaps Grand Junction, Colorado. That would save a little bit of money, too.
If only we knew the director of the Office of Interior.
Thank you. Also, energy dominance. Speaking of the Director of Interior, American energy dominance, I think, is a great thing to be proud of, to support, and to pursue. American energy dominance, I think, is a very strong and powerful diplomatic tool as well as economic driver. But the budget does have about $1.3 billion cuts to the Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Office, and that could affect the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I want to make sure that you view renewable energy as part of American energy dominance.
We do a couple of different things. I'll make very clear that we're absolutely satisfied that under the proposals we have that no labs will close, number one. Number two, what the budget does reflect, Senator Gardner, is a refocusing, a reprioritization of basic research. And there are places where we believe that the federal government has moved out of the role of basic research into more applied research, stuff that's closer to market. And what we're simply doing is saying, look, that's the stuff the private sector should be able to take care of. Let's refocus our efforts on basic research in those areas.
Thank you. And I'm going to run out of time here, but I want to summarize a couple of the questions I was going to ask. DACA. This week we're debating DACA. We're debating a very important solution. Hundreds of thousands of workers legally right now in Colorado that are going to be affected by the decisions this Senate makes, this Congress makes over the next several weeks. Just back of the page math. We're looking at a population in jobs right now that could be responsible for as much as 0.3, 0.4% of GDP. And if that was a group of people that were to be eliminated out of the workforce, I think that would have a detrimental effect on a budget projection of 3% growth or more as we try to achieve that. So that's something to consider as we go forward. Very important that we get this. NAFTA, critical to our economy. Critical to growth, critical to that GDP assumption that we're building into our budgets. Obviously, trade overall is, and I think any kind of decision on NAFTA that could affect our trade dominance, so to speak, could negatively affect, if it's in a negative way, could negatively affect the GDP growth as well that we face. And finally, a quick question that you can get back to me on. I don't know, when we were talking about concerns over revenues, have you given any thought, or the administration given any thought to monetizing Freddie Mae, Fannie Mac, something like that? What it would Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, what it would mean?
Senator, that is a longer discussion for another day, but yes, there is considerable discussion going on within the administration, led in part by Treasury and HUD, as to what to do about the government-sponsored enterprises. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Director Mulvaney. First, and I can't talk about this at length, but very, very disturbed that the Trump administration reneged on the long-standing plan to consolidate the FBI campus in a way that would provide a more secure setting. We can have that conversation later. So back in 2016, during the campaign, candidate Trump called himself the, quote, king of debt. It's pretty clear that this is one of the promises he has kept as president of the United States. To my friend Senator Corker, who said this is the first time we've seen a quote, honest budget because it doesn't balance in 10 years, actually, President Obama presented budgets that were very honest. They did not balance in 10 years, and you and our Republican colleagues raked over the coals for that. But what we saw was borrowing $1.5 trillion to give windfall tax breaks to corporations. And since Maryland was brought up, I would just point out our legislature is now having to try pass laws to stop big tax increases on Marylanders. 350,000 plus Maryland households will see tax increases, including 123,000 Maryland tax households with incomes between $25,000 and $50,000. That is not a middle-class tax cut. That's a tax increase on hundreds of thousands of Marylanders. Now, I want to ask you about what you say in here about the Trump economy, because the more I look at these numbers, it looks like the Trump administration is simply benefiting from the continuation of the Obama economy. You say here the Trump economics is working. You cite the fact that 2 million jobs were added in calendar year 2017. It's on page 1 of your testimony. It's great that 2 million jobs were created. That's fewer jobs than were created the previous year in 2016, isn't it?
Don't have the numbers in front of me, Senator, but I believe you.
It is somewhat fewer than the year before, and it's fewer than in 2015, isn't it?
Again, I don't have the historical data, but there's no reason for you to lie to me.
The reality is it's fewer than in any year since 2011. So I'm glad we saw 2 million jobs created, but it's interesting to herald this as a great new result of the Trump economy when it's less than in any year since 2011. I want to look at the rate of economic growth. Economic growth last year was actually slower than it was in 2015 and 2014. And I went back and I looked at what the CBO projected, for economic growth in 2017. Do you know what they projected in 2017?
Again, I don't have the historical numbers. I know that we projected 2.3 in last year's budget, and you accused me of being way too optimistic.
Actually, I did not accuse you of being way too optimistic with respect to that number. That was the same number CBO had. I said what you did last year, and it sounded like you confessed a little bit to it, that last year's budget was very overly optimistic with respect to out years. But my question here, Director Mulvaney, is this. Because I'm just puzzled by these claims of how the first year of the Trump administration deregulation brought all this added economic growth. The CBO projected 2.3% growth in 2017. That wasn't based on any assumptions about Trump economics. That was just based on where they saw the economy going. And in fact, the economy grew at 2.25, a little lower than what CBO projected. So I'm trying to figure out where the basis for your comment. You just made it again, that this first year deregulation produced all this economic growth when it was actually slightly lower than what CBO projected, and they didn't take into account any of those claims.
Senator, I think if you look at the last 3 quarters, we had 2 quarters over 3%. The fourth quarter was just under 3%. Including some tremendous financials. We think that I think the Atlanta Fed just predicted first quarter growth someplace in the neighborhood of 5.4. So I think everybody, I mean, left and right, has admitted that the economy grew faster last year than expected.
Well, I don't think so. CBO projected 2.3%. I never quarreled with that number, and actually it was slightly lower than that. So this sounds a lot more like puffery than reality. My last question, putting your other hat on, CFPB.
Yes, sir.
As you know, your predecessor at CFPB filed a lawsuit against some scam artists in the payday lending area. One of them was Golden Valley, which charged like 950% interest rates. I mean, this is higher than mafia loan sharks. It's reported that you dropped that lawsuit, and the spokesperson for CFPB on the first said that you were not part of the decision, and then said you were. Simple question. Were you part of the decision to drop the case against Golden Valley?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll follow up with that. I think it's an outrageous decision and an anti-consumer decision.
Fair amount. Keep in mind, Senator, because you and I are always very candid with each other, there is an ongoing investigation into Golden Valley, so it'd be unlikely I'd be able to answer many of your questions other than the one you've just asked.
Well, it sounds like you dropped the lawsuit.
We dropped. Again, let me be very clear in my wording, because I have the lawyers sitting here behind me, that there is an ongoing investigation against Golden Valley, and for that reason, it's not appropriate for me to comment on that work. I can't answer the specific question that you asked me.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, and we appreciate all of your hard work. The administration budget projects the debt to GDP ratio will begin to decline in 2023 and ultimately reduce below pre-recession levels over the 25-year horizon. Presumably, economic growth plays a role in this change of trajectory as well as restraining spending. Can you explain some of the key policies that Congress should consider in order to put our country back on a fiscally sustainable path? And then also, what is a healthy debt to GDP ratio, in your all's estimation?
Yeah. I'll deal with the second question first. I think a lot of the academic literature would suggest to you that 80% really is sort of that danger zone. So if we can keep it below that, that would be great. I'd love to see it below 60, which is back below, I think, below the pre-recession numbers. But we have too much now, I think, is the short answer to your question. Regarding the policies that we would encourage the Congress to consider, on the revenue side, Senator, you may not have been here earlier when we mentioned that this budget assumes that the individual tax rates, which expire, the reductions that expire 5 years into the current window, we assume those to be permanent. And I will tell you that our assumptions regarding long-term growth assume that they are permanent. So we encourage you to keep an eye on the revenues. And if the revenues do, in fact, turn out the way we expect them to be, and again, we expect revenues to decline in the short term, as you and I discussed during the discussion of the tax bill, but to start to increase, actually increase almost immediately and to turn positive compared to the baseline by 2023, and are almost $350 billion to the positive by 2027. So let's continue to watch the revenue line and to continue to tweak the tax bill to make sure we can maintain that. On the spending side, Senator, we've offered $3 trillion in long-term savings over the course of the budget. 1.7 of that is on the mandatory side. I think you and I share a concern that the mandatory side of the budget continues to eat into a larger and larger share of our spending every single year. And while fiscal restraint in any form is to be encouraged, certainly taking a look at that mandatory spending would be helpful.
What's a healthy GDP to deficits? Where are we at now?
Senator, right now, deficits, I think we're approaching 5 in the next year or two. We get down to 1.1, 1.2, I think, by the end of the 10-year window. That's better than 0. I'd like to see a balanced budget in the long term. But if you're going to run a little bit of a deficit, keeping it as low as possible would be advisable.
Okay.
Actually, let's put it to you this way. I would love to see revenues growing faster than expenses. And that allows us to shrink the size of the deficit as a percentage of GDP every single year. You run a business, and if your business's expenses are growing faster than your revenues, you are in trouble, and so is the government.
Right. No, that's a good point. Tell me, we're in the process now of the DACA voting and things, trying to get that sorted out. One of the things that's very important to the President, very important to myself and so many others, is securing the border. we'd like to make it such that we have a significant amount of money, going that way, because it's going to take that. How do we do that in a way that we can get some money up front and yet protect that money into the future, but also, very importantly, making sure that we have the oversight that we need going forward?
The good news, Senator, is that as we sat down to look at the CAPS deal that was just signed, it does provide considerable additional funding, and we actually take a big chunk of that and put that towards border security, and including wall, including the wall. In fact, I think you may have heard me say earlier that our budget assumes a DACA deal. It assumes an immigration agreement is reached. We want one to be reached. We'll make that very clear on behalf of the administration. And for that reason, we actually explicitly assume that a deal is reached and that the money for the wall is set aside. One of the early proposals that we've sent down for you all to consider is to set up a trust fund so that while we have the money available, with the caps being increased this year and next, that we set aside that money in that trust fund so that we don't have a situation like we had in 2006, where border security was authorized but was never appropriated.
No, I agree with that totally. And again, as far as the oversight, how do you oversee the trust fund? What would be your proposal to?
I don't know if we've gotten to the details yet on how to do that, Senator. All I can offer you is the examples that we've brought to some of the other agencies. I mentioned earlier that we've finally been able to bring the Defense Department to an auditable position after many years of trying. And I'll give several administrations credit for doing that, but it was finished in September of this year. We would encourage at least that same level of oversight, if not more, on that trust.
I think it's really important. We don't want the border wall to be the new CFPB.
I absolutely agree with that, Senator. I think one of the risks that you run if you put it in the ordinary appropriations is not only that it's not spent, but that it's misspent in order to get that appropriation out the door that year, as opposed to taking a longer-term view that you might be able to take with a trust fund.
No, I agree, and that's why we need to be creative and create some sort of a hybrid to make sure that both of those are accomplished, with the money being there, but also with the good oversight that it's going to require.
Absolutely agree.
Thank you.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have cuts in this budget. Just can take 4 line items: health and Medicare and higher ed and food, that is SNAP, and there's $1.5 trillion right there. So, big outline for America. Let's give $1.5 trillion in tax bill to the wealthiest Americans and proceed to cut our health, our commitment to our seniors on health as well, cut the affordability of college, because, the rich are okay. They can pay their college. Don't worry about the rest of Americans. And by the way, the hungry in America, too bad. Let those children go hungry. They're from poor families. They don't matter. What kind of a message does this send about this administration that said they're going to work for working families, going to address the challenges of living wage jobs and health and education? And right here, health and education get hit enormously, the foundations for families to thrive. Or we can take some other, there's more cuts than that. How about the $3.4 billion to heating and the offset of a tax cut to Wells Fargo of the same amount? What's more important, Mr. Director? The heating program or the tax cut to Wells Fargo, which has defrauded so many hundreds of thousands of people across this country? Which one's more important to you?
Actually, Senator, I'm familiar with the $3.39 billion in LIHEAP. I think I addressed that earlier with Senator Sanders. I'm happy to review it if you like. I'm not at all familiar.
I'm just asking which one's more important to you, the cut to heating or the tax cut to Wells Fargo, which has defrauded so many people?
Senator, I'd have to challenge the...
Yeah, I've noticed you never answer questions from Democrats, so I'm not expecting you to answer, but I thought I'd give you the chance. Or how about the $4.3 billion cut to rental assistance? We have people living on the streets and the cloverleafs and the underpasses all across America because the cost of housing over the last 4 decades has gone up enormously compared to living wage. But you want to do a $4.3 billion cut in rental assistance while giving $6 billion to ExxonMobil. Which is more important to you? People having housing or $6 billion ExxonMobil? Which one?
One of the things I mentioned during my opening
It's a
statement,
choice of the
Senator.
two. You can answer one way or the other. I think the public would like to know.
It is, but I don't like to answer loaded questions that are simply rhetorical and may not be correct. I'm not even sure that $4.3 billion number is right. As
That
I
is
mentioned
the amount in your budget, and you should be aware of that when you
in my opening
testify
statement
here.
Let's
Let's turn to something about the after-school programs, the STEM programs, our ability to undertake high-tech advancements in our economy. You've got about a billion to $1.4 billion to the Koch brothers, and $1.2 billion reduction in after-school STEM programs. Which is more important, educating our children or more money for the Koch brothers?
and again, I can't even see that part of your.
Do you think the Koch brothers consider it a good investment that they say they'll spend $400 million in the next election, and then they get you to give them a $1.4 billion reduction in their taxes?
Again,
That's a pretty
Senator,
good investment for the Koch brothers?
Yeah, I have no clue where that $1.4 billion range comes from, or if it's accurate.
Or how about Chevron getting $2 billion while you cut development assistance by $2.8 billion? Everything we see in this budget is about help to the powerful and an assault on working Americans. And I hear a whole lot of bragging about, oh, we're going to help lower-income Americans with a tax cut, but you put a provision into the tax bill that will wipe out health care for 13 million people and raise health premiums more than 10% next year for the rest. That in itself wipes out any gains from the tax bill. I'm really disappointed to see that the philosophy this administration ran on of fighting for ordinary Americans became just, this is an administration by and for the powerful and about undermining the opportunity for ordinary families to thrive. Now let's turn to your other role. You seem to take great pleasure in having wiped out the payday loan rule and allow interest rates of 500 to 1,000%, far more than the mafia ever charged. Why is that a good thing for America?
Senator, I think it's inaccurate to say that we've wiped out the payday rule. We've simply given notice that we're going to take additional comments on additional rulemaking.
Did you or did you not suspend implementation of the payday rule?
Again, we gave notice that the payday rule, as far as I know, is still in effect. We've simply given notice that we are going to take additional comment for additional rulemaking.
You delayed it. You can call it whatever you want, but you prevented it from going into effect. I'm not sure why you're dancing around about it, because you seem pretty happy about having done so to help out these payday loan companies charging 500 to 1,000%.
I'm sorry, was there a question there, Senator?
Yeah. The question is, when you're so happy about having helped out the payday loan companies, why don't you own it now? Why do you want to dodge the question?
Again, Senator, we've given notice that we're going to take additional comments for additional rulemaking.
How about Equifax? Millions of Americans, 143 million Americans, lost the integrity of their data, and you just let them off the hook. No accountability. How about accountability? How about that concept being embedded in the work of what was our consumer watchdog that now is our consumer rollover and let the big companies scratch its belly organization?
On Equifax, I can tell you, Senator, that there's been no change in the position of the previous leadership of CFPB regarding Equifax.
Yeah, okay. All right. If you're going to make these decisions, you might as well own them and defend them. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. About priorities, I want to thank you and the President for negotiating a budget agreement that gives long overdue relief to the military on behalf of the men and women who've been serving, who've been asked to do a lot with a little bit. Thanks. I just cannot tell you how important it is that we set aside the sequestration cuts for the next 2 years and rebuild our military, and I want to thank you and the President. That was great leadership. Graham Cassidy, you mentioned that in the budget. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. In fact, we assume it passes.
Well, I hope it will. Can you sort of explain to the committee here very briefly why you think it's important that it does pass?
Well, we do. It does a couple of different things. Writ large, it transfers control of this issue, this very important issue of health care, to the states, and we just think that's a more efficient way to provide that service. You and I both served in the South Carolina State Legislature, and I absolutely believe in my heart of hearts that South Carolina knows better for South Carolinians and how to provide them with health care than we do in this chamber. And Graham Cassidy goes to the very heart of that while providing, importantly, the funding necessary for states to do that. Oftentimes we hear folks say, let's just give it to the states, but we don't give them the funds necessary to do it, the unfunded mandates we hear so much about at the state level. Graham Cassidy does not do that. So we think at a bunch of different places, both fiscally and in terms of policy, it is by far the best idea we've seen come down the pipe in a long time.
If I could just build on what you said, 4 states received 35% of the money under Obamacare funding as it is today. They're Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, and California, all great folks. They're 22% of the population. Under Graham Cassidy, we try in a 10-year period to level out that funding, to have it per patient it be the same no matter where you live, then we'll adjust for inflation based on region. Do you think that's a fair way to deliver health care?
No.
Yeah.
Again, that's one of the reasons that we support the Graham Cassidy bill and hope that you all see fit to pass it at some point.
Well, I think every state will benefit, and we'll try to make it as least amount of pain as possible to the 4 states who get most of the money compared to the other states. MOX, I asked 3 questions 2 years ago about alternatives to MOX. Can I just send you these questions, or should I send them to DOE?
Copy us both, because as you and I know, we've met together with Secretary Perry. We're very much aware of your concerns and your interest in MOX. You're also concerned, I think you're aware of ours.
Yeah.
Which is that there needs to be a more cost-effective way to do what we're doing.
Right. So what I'll do is I'll send a copy of the questions, the basic questions about an alternative, to you and Secretary Perry, because from your personal view, do you think it's 70% complete, 30% complete, the MOX program? What do you think?
My concern, Senators, that I've seen projections that say it may not be finished till the 2030s, and that it's sort of, I think the last time they asked the people what it would cost to finish, they couldn't give an answer, and that, as the budget director, that really, really worries me.
Well, I think it's 70% complete, and I think we can get you an answer on what it will cost to complete. I just don't think there's a viable alternative. But the State Department, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. Ultimately, that was General Mattis when he was sitting commander. Do you doubt that statement?
I don't, Senator. I would encourage folks to look at the State Department budget, realize that the President ran on saying we were going to give less money to other countries overseas, and the State Department budget does contain a lot of that foreign aid, and that's what represents a lot of those reductions.
So it's a 20% reduction in the State Department's budget.
It is, but I think we increase spending on humanitarian assistance. We do lower our commitments to some of the multilateral institutions to try and right-size our contributions to support what Ambassador Haley is doing. So, but we're very much aware of your concerns and look forward to working with you on trying to make the State Department more effective.
Do you agree that the State Department is really national security in another form, as General Mattis indicated?
What do they say, that war is just diplomacy by other means? So yes, sir, the two are intricately entwined.
So I will look forward to working with you to make sure that we do not take off the table diplomatic options, not only to prevent war, to make sure that the gains on the battlefield are not lost. And I think, again, General Mattis said it better than I could ever say, that this is a steep cut in the State Department that will lead to instability, put our people at risk or serving overseas, and I look forward to working with you. I think you're doing a very good job, and I really appreciate the steady hand you provided when it comes to budget matters and your willingness to negotiate and compromise. So thank you very much. We're all proud of you at home.
Thank you, Senator. I wish I got back there more often.
Senator Murray.
Thank you, Chairman Enzi. Now, before I turn to Director Mulvaney, I do want to comment on the new Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations process that was included in the budget caps deal. I expect we'll be hearing a lot about that in the coming months, and I just want to make my views very clear. Republicans spent 2017 hijacking the budget process for 2 things. First of all, a partisan attempt to take health care away from millions of families, which thankfully crashed and burned. And second, jamming through the massive tax cut for the wealthiest Americans and a permanent tax cut for the biggest corporations, without even trying to work with Democrats on ways we could help the middle class. Now, in 2018, things have been a little different. Republicans came to the table and worked with us on a 2-year budget deal that increased investments in education and health care and child care and other domestic and military priorities. Now, finally, the Appropriations Committee has clarity and we are able to get to work and pass our bills by the March deadline. So with all due respect to Chairman Enzi and my House and Senate Republican colleagues, we don't need a new select committee to tell us what the problem is. It's pretty obvious. This budget committee has been unable or unwilling to do its job. So we had to lurch into one crisis and then another before the rest of Congress could come together and clean up a mess. I'm hoping we can do our jobs on the Appropriations Committee, and I continue to hope that this committee can do its job and not rely on new select committees that are intended to pass the buck instead of making the tough calls. And I just wanted to make that clear. Director Mulvaney, if this were a normal budget hearing, I would start off by commenting that budgets are statements of values and priorities, and I would dig into the various proposals, what they said about what kind of country we were, what kind of country we wanted to be. If this were a normal budget committee, I would point out that the so-called immigration proposals it includes are wasteful, divisive. I'd point out that it is widely misguided and simply wrong to ask low-income families and the workers who need a hand up to bear the brunt of massive cuts while trillions are being spent on tax cuts for the rich and while austerity flies out the window when it comes to the military. If this were a normal budget committee hearing, I would point out how absurd it is to cut $200 billion in financial aid for college while students are struggling to afford college and keep their heads above water. And I'd point out serious concern about this administration's request for veterans care. You know, if this were a normal budget committee, I may even praise some of the attention that's finally being paid to tackling the opioid crisis. But, Director Mulvaney, this is anything but a normal budget and budget committee hearing. President Trump just signed a 2-year budget agreement into law that makes this request irrelevant. Democrats and Republicans have ignored President Trump's budget request before in the interest of trying to get something done, and this one will be no different. So it seems this budget proposal is only good for one thing, reminding people across the country that President Trump cares more about giving tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations than he does about investing in health care and education and child care and middle-class priorities. So, Director Mulvaney, for years I've heard you rail against deficit spending. You called yourself a deficit hawk. You claimed to take our debt very seriously. You called for balanced budget amendments. You said our debt is, quote, so large as to defy description. Well, the debt's only grown since. The deficit has increased under this administration, approaching $1 trillion this year and next. And it can't, quote, defy description because you describe it in the pages of this budget proposal. And don't even try to hold yourself to the standard you held President Obama to when you were a member of Congress. So I was prepared to come here today and call you out on the hypocrisy, but then I heard you on Sunday that if you were in Congress, you would have voted against the budget legislation that President Trump just signed. So I wanted to give you a chance today to step back from the hypocrisy. If you were in Congress, would you have voted for this budget that you're presenting?
Sure, and I give the same answer I gave on Sunday, which is that as a member of Congress representing the 5th District of South Carolina, I probably would have found enough shortcomings in this to vote against it, as did many members of this committee. But I'm the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and my job is to try and fund the President's priorities, which is exactly what we did.
So you would say this is a no-us member of Congress?
Yeah, I think I've said that before.
Okay.
I don't think that reflects on my opinion of it as a member of the administration.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one more question.
I'm just trying to give an honest question to an honest answer,
appreciate it.
Senator.
I appreciate it. Republicans have busted our budget with trillions in tax cuts for the rich, and this budget starts asking the middle class to actually pay for that. You have said before that you would like to cut Social Security and Medicare. Can you commit to me today that you will not be asking for a penny of cuts to benefits from either of these critical programs in future budgets to pay for the President's tax cuts?
And that's exactly what this budget reflects. The proposals that you see that touch on Social Security, do not deal with old age retirement benefits, do not deal with core Social Security, as we discussed last year. We try to address some reforms within Social Security disability insurance.
What do you propose?
I think, well, in Medicare, for example, let's talk about Medicare, because that was the other thing we do not propose any changes to any benefits, any services to beneficiaries. We try to focus on lowering drug prices within Medicare. The number I've heard, by the way, a couple times today and in the press is that we propose to cut Medicare by $500 billion, $500 billion. That's just not right. The number is $236 billion, and most of that is tied up in drug reforms and some other proposals. For example, Senator Bryan, thank you for the time to do this, but I don't know if you know this or not, but your Medicare money that you pay in FICA that goes into the Medicare Trust Fund actually goes to pay for graduate medical school tuition. It goes to pay for bad debts from non-Medicare patients at hospitals. And we propose to move that.
Are you eliminating that?
We do actually move that onto another part of the budget so that we actually still pay those, but we don't pay them out of the trust fund. And a lot of folks have said, well, that's a cut to Medicare. No, it's not. It's actually improving the Medicare trust fund, and I think the proposals...
somewhere else where you can cut it. Okay, yeah. I got it, and we're out of time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Director, I'm over here.
You're on my right. I know that, Senator Kennedy.
Yes, sir. It's the correct place to be.
That's right.
This is America. We all are entitled to our opinion, but I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you, sir.
I know you to be a fiscal conservative. I think you share my I don't know, concern, disbelief, curiosity. I don't understand why taking care of our generation requires robbing the next generation. I want to thank you in your budget for emphasizing our need to do something about improper payments. As you know better than I do, we've got $144 billion of improper payments being made every year. And we're not going to stop all of them, but if we can stop 20%, that's $30 billion. I've introduced a bill with Senator Carper to try, it's called the Stop Paying Dead People Act. And I mean, I was just amazed. You can't make this stuff up. We've got a death file at Social Security, but Social Security won't share it with its sister agencies. So dead people are getting checks, and they're being cashed. Obviously, there's fraud. In some states, you can vote when you're dead, but cashing a government check is just a bridge too far as I'm concerned. So I hope you'll continue that. In the few minutes I have left, I want to get a little maybe metaphysical here. We talk about the need for a balanced budget, but sometimes, and I support a balanced budget, but sometimes I think we conflate balanced budget with government spending, and here's what I mean. We've got a $20 trillion economy. That's all the goods and services we produce every year. If government is spending $4 trillion, I know the president's budget comes in a little higher, but if government is spending $4 trillion, government's taking $4 trillion out of that, let's say, $20 trillion. You with me so far? Okay. Do you think that America would be better off if we had a balanced budget of $4 trillion government spending and $4 trillion of taxes? Or would we be better off in terms of personal liberty if we had $2 trillion worth of spending and $1 trillion of taxes, and therefore would have to borrow $1 trillion?
Well, from an individual liberty side, if you assume for sake of this discussion that the larger the government is, the less individual freedom you have, then by definition, you'd be better off from an individual liberty standpoint by having that $2 trillion government expenditure versus with only $1 trillion worth of taken out of the economy. Plus, I think I could make the argument to you, take individual liberties out of the equation and look at the allocation of capital. If I give $4 trillion to the government, it is likely to misapply a lot of that, spend it inefficiently, whereas if I let people keep more of their own money, they are, by definition, going to apply it very efficiently. In fact, that is efficient. That's the market. People spending their own money is the market, and nothing allocates capital more efficiently than the free market. So I think in many ways you'd be better off by having that smaller footprint.
Well, I'm going to be clear. I support a balanced budget, and I know you do too. But would one way to skin this cat be to approach legislation that would limit government spending to a certain percentage of GDP?
Certainly in theory, yes, sir.
Okay. Do you think the president would support something like that?
I don't know. I've not talked to the president. I know that that came up a couple times in the House, Senate. I know you and I have not talked about this before, so we're just sort of thinking off the top of our heads. But I think that actually came up in the past as part of a debate regarding a balanced budget amendment. Would we cap government expenditures as a percentage of the overall economy? The theory being that it was okay to grow the grow the government as long as you were growing the economy at the same time. Go back to my comments before about your revenues growing faster than your expenses. It's wrong to grow government faster than the economies of the people that can pay for it.
I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Director, for your service.
Thank you, Senator.
I'm a big admirer.
Senator Perdue.
Director, thank you for surviving another one. It's always interesting.
It was a lot easier than the first time I was in this room, I can tell you.
They don't get any easier, I'm sure. I want to make a comment, Mr. Chairman, very quickly before I get to two questions quickly. One is I take a different view totally than the senator from Washington. I respect her work over the years, and I know we can work together, but we have got to fix this budget process. Director, I know we've had this conversation. I think you agree with this. I'm not asking for you on the record right now, but I want to make a comment. The budget process has only worked 4 times in 44 years. It's led to this debacle of $20 trillion. We're not going to solve our debt crisis over the next 20 or 30 years unless and until we fix this debt crisis. I applaud leadership on the House and Senate. I applaud the White House's support of this select committee, and I look forward to its outcome later this year. Director, I want to comment just a question on the debt. The size of this government in 2000, last year, Bill Clinton was $2.4 trillion in current dollars. Last year was about $4 trillion directionally. There's our problem. The largest growth of that, though, was in the mandatory side. Today, of $4 trillion, 75% of that is mandatory. Only about 25% is discretionary. That's what you have to work with primarily. And I'm concerned about over the last administration, we borrowed about 35%. It looks like over the next 10 years in this budget, we'll borrow somewhere north of 30%, which means that every dime we spend in discretionary money is fundamentally borrowed. It's new debt. I know your heart. I know what you've done historically on this. Help us understand sort of the long-term investment return concept I know the White House has in terms of dealing with the debt. There are things that we have to invest in growing the economy. We have to build the infrastructure and all that. That will yield return, as I understand it, and I believe that. The question is are we moving toward a longer-term solution outside a 10-year window that is a directional pathway toward getting this debt down to some more meaningful percentage of GDP. We talk about spending. The problem with spending is of the $1 trillion, only $350 is non-military. Of the $1.1 trillion discretionary, about $700 now is military, about $200 is VA, and the balance there of $350 is all the domestic discretionary programs that we still have out there, and they've been cut dramatically as well in the last decade. So, give me some comfort that we have at least a north eye on the long-term solution toward this mounting debt crisis.
We do. Unfortunately, Senator, we've got an example that works. We've actually balanced the budget during my adult lifetime back in the late 1990s.
On a per-year basis?
On a per-year basis. I recognize there was some funny accounting when it came to the Social Security receipts and so forth. But if you look generally to the concept, what happened was we figured out a way to grow the economy faster than we expected, and we had fiscal restraint. Democrats take credit for it, Republicans take credit for it, but the truth of the matter is that government grew slower than the economy, and if you can do that long enough, revenues will catch up. In terms of, and you and I have not talked about this either, but we've talked in the administration a lot of times about prioritizing deficits. There's actually different types of deficits. Deficits that allow people to keep more of their own money because of the allocation of capital is actually a fairly relative, efficient deficit. In the middle, you might have stuff on things like infrastructure, where at least you might get some return on that. The least efficient, from an economic standpoint, type of deficit would be something for a wealth transfer payment. So we do try and prioritize that as we look across our deficits going forward. But the big picture writ large is you have to figure out a way to grow your economy faster than you're growing your government.
Thank you for that. One last question, Mr. Chairman. With regard to infrastructure investments, again, as you just said, investments hopefully that will produce a return, unlike the $1 trillion that we threw toward investment in infrastructure back in 2011 that was not made with that those priorities. I call out one type of investments now, particularly when we talk about spending the money we're talking about in this budget on infrastructure. The question is, are we prioritizing based on the return that we get in terms of economic growth and contribution then in turn to reducing this long-term debt? And I specifically call out an issue that I believe is caught between current authorizations and the future infrastructure investments. And those are in states like Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, your home state of South Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey. These are our ports, our eastern ports, that are all trying to accommodate the new Panamax ships that would dramatically improve our ability to compete around the world. I believe those investments are caught up in the Army Corps of Engineers budgets being cut, but are not being moved over to the infrastructure investments. And these port investments actually offer a higher rate of return than some of the infrastructure investments I think that we contemplated. Can you address that?
I would. At the risk of making a small correction, we absolutely anticipate that the deep water ports will be part of the infrastructure bill. In fact, the largest part of the infrastructure bill, the 50% of the $200 billion, $100 billion is sort of, in our mind, set aside for programs that can contribute their own portion of the funding. And as you know, the Port of Savannah does exactly that. So no, we had specifically the deep water ports in mind when we fashioned the infrastructure bill.
That's comforting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank the director for his comments. I do want to ask an additional question here, just from some confusion about GDP that we were talking about earlier. The president's budget projects GDP growth average of 3% annually with a long-term trend line of 2.8%. This long-term trend is 0.9 percentage points higher than the CBO's 1.9% forecast, which was published in the June prior to the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's been downward pressure in the long-term projections due to demographic changes. How does the administration reach its growth projections, and how will the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act encourage the labor force participation?
Thank you for the question. At the risk of getting deep down in the weeds and showing my inner geek, we were fairly disappointed in the GDP numbers in the fourth quarter. We expected them to be north of 3. They were not. But if you drill down into the details, one of the things you'll see that the capital investment and the durable good numbers were almost 4 times what we expected. We were expecting something about 0.8, 0.9, and they came in just south of 3%. That's how you do it, Senator. And that's why such a critical part of the tax bill, gentlemen, was that corporate tax rate and the depreciation rules. In order to get the type of GDP growth that we need long-term, given the demographic challenges that we face, we need individual productivity to increase. That comes from capital investment. Either you invest in a new machine, you invest in new technology, you invest in education, and you get individual productivity up. And we think we've seen the seeds of that planted almost immediately. Someone mentioned earlier that we've seen benefits from the tax bill far quicker than we thought that we would. Everyone pays attention to the bonuses that were given and the wage increases that were given. But if you look even deeper into the numbers and you see the investments that people are making, companies are making in the United States of America, we think we see the seeds planted for long-term structural improvements to our productivity and thus our economic health.
I'm counting on that proving out. I did ask for a static score when we were working on taxes because during the health care debate, we asked for a dynamic score, and I found out that that was going to require 6 weeks for every amendment to be evaluated. And we don't do legislation where we have 6 weeks between amendments. It may seem like that, but we don't have. So I was not able to do that. So I want to thank you for your testimony today. Your full statement will be included in the record. I think you did an outstanding job of presenting the President's suggestions and priorities, and that's what the President's budget is suggestions and priorities, because the Constitution actually specifies that we're the ones that are going to be doing the actual work on that. I do hope we find a better process for doing that actual work. Another little inconsistency that I heard this morning was saying that for preschool, there needs to be a program for preschool. I've been saying that all along since I got here. There were 119 when I started. We got it down to 45 preschool programs. It seems to me like one or two really good ones reviewed again and reauthorized might be better. There are also some comments about housing programs here. I checked, there are 160 housing programs administered by 20 agencies. Nobody's in charge, nobody's setting goals, nobody's checking to see if they're being met. So how can we say that a decrease in the housing funding would put people out on the streets? We might actually come up with some better solutions. A little note that I found in reading through your documents was a suggestion that colleges have some risk accepted on student loans. That's kind of a novel concept. We kind of made the for-profit schools do that same thing, and we put them out of business. But there ought to be some kind of risk acceptance in it. I appreciate your comments about capital budgeting, and you've used an example of the FBI building for that. I've been talking about capital budgeting since I got here. I think separating that out might make our job a little bit easier. I would mention that if anybody has any additional questions, the questions can be submitted for the record by 6 p.m. today with the signed hard copy delivered to the clerk at Dirksen 624. Then you'll have up to 7 days to respond to those questions to get additional good information so that we can understand this budget as well as we can so that we can do our budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Outstanding presentation. Adjourned.